All good, it's all good. Pecan pie is the quintessential Southern dessert. It has a buttery, flaky pie crust and a sweet, gooey, sometimes fudgy, nutty filling that I just love. And for me, it's not Thanksgiving unless there's a pecan pie on the table. Hi, I'm Rhoda from MadeIN, and today I'm going to show you how to make my Bourbon Pecan Slab Pie. So slab pies are kind of like a big Pop-Tart in that they are not baked in a round baking dish. They're baked in a rectangular dish. So there's more crust to filling ratio. So if you're a crust lover, you will love slab pies. The first thing I'm going to do is cut up my butter. Once I get this cubed, I'm going to freeze it for 15 minutes. That's just to help keep it really, really ice cold when it goes into the dough because I don't want it to melt. I want it to keep its shape. Butter's nice and cold. Now it's time to make the dough. I'm gonna make this pie dough in a food processor. I like to use a food processor because it's so fast and predictable for me. All-purpose flour, just a little bit of sugar. Pecan pie is pretty sweet as it is, but there's just a little bit of sugar in this dough, and kosher salt because you have to have salt in your desserts. So now I'm gonna just pulse these together just a little bit, just to mix them up. And now I'm ready to add the butter. So the butter's nice and cold. I'm just gonna pulse it a little bit because I wanna have pea-sized clumps of butter in the dough. Wherever there's butter, the water will turn to steam when it starts to bake, and that will create a flaky crust. My butter is in pea-sized clumps, and that's what I want. I'm ready to add my liquid. Just like the frozen butter, I need to use really cold water. So I've got some ice cubes in here, and I'm just gonna measure out a 1/4 cup. When you're making pie dough, heat is not your friend. You wanna keep everything as cold as possible. Stream that in. And I'm adding a little bit of apple cider vinegar also for extra flavor. And I'm gonna wait until it just comes together, just starts to pull away from the bowl. I feel like it could use a little bit more water because it's still really sandy. So I'm just gonna add another tablespoon of super cold water. So it's just come together, and that's what I want. If you press a little bit of the dough together, it should stick to itself. So that's what I'm looking for. You don't wanna overwork your dough in the food processor, so I'm just gonna bring it together by hand the last step of the way. And for a slab pie, you need double the crust of a regular 9-inch standard pie. So either a double crust pie dough recipe will work, or just double your favorite 9-inch pie dough recipe. So I'm just gonna knead this together just to help it to come together the rest of the way. Don't wanna overwork it or overhandle it, or else it's gonna get too warm. I've got it in some plastic wrap, and I'm just kind of working it into the shape that I want without touching it too much. And if I was making a pie in a round baking dish, I would work this into a circle. But since I'm going to be placing it in a rectangular baking dish, I'm going to make it into a rectangle. Then I have less work to do when it's time to roll it. I don't want to touch it too much because even though I don't have super hot hands, I just don't want to heat up this dough. I want to keep it as cold as possible. I'm going to let this rest in the fridge for at least an hour, preferably overnight. All right, I have my dough. It's nicely chilled. I'm just going to beat it a little bit just to soften it. And you want to work pretty quickly when you're working with pie dough. Just like before, I don't really want it to warm up. If it starts to get a little bit warm while you're working with it, you can always pop it back in the fridge for a few minutes. Since I'm making a slab pie, I am working with a double crust pie dough recipe. I want a little bit of a border, so I'm going to roll this out to about 11 by 15. This rolling pin is going to help me just get the dough to an even thickness. And I started out with a rectangular shape, and I'm going to end up with rectangular shape. I'm going for about a 1/4 inch thickness on the dough. I'm going to use the rolling pin to roll up this dough. I've got my baking slab, and I'm just going to quickly unfurl this into my baking slab. And I want this to kind of fall into the corners. I'm not stretching it, I'm just kind of letting it slump in so that I won't have any shrinkage when this actually bakes. And I want to have about an inch border all the way around for my crimp. So I'm just going to trim it now. I cut a little notch out of the corner so that when I fold the dough in on itself, it won't be too thick in the corners. I can tell that the dough is really getting warm, so I'm going to get this in the fridge. I'm going to let the dough chill for about 5-10 minutes, just to cool it off before I work with it again. And now I'm ready to crimp it. So for this crimp, I'm just gonna fold the dough over itself, and it doesn't have to be perfect. The little notches I took out of the corners help make it not too thick. Really just crimp to make it look pretty. If you wanted to, you could just cut it off at the rim, but I just think crimping makes it special. I like to use a chopstick for crimping, but you can also use your fingers. This is our MadeIN French porcelain baking slab. It was designed by Nancy Silverton, who is one of, if not the goddess of baking. The French porcelain makes it really naturally non-stick. It's very easy to clean. The way that the walls are designed of this baking dish really help with the crust formation. Definitely don't have to crimp. I'm only doing this because I think it looks pretty. Okay, now this is gonna go back in the fridge while I make the filling. All right, my crimped crust is chilling, and now it's time to make the filling. That arrived. I'm gonna start by chopping my pecans. I have 3 cups of pecans that are gonna get chopped, and then I have 2 cups that are gonna remain whole for putting on top of the pie. I'm just starting by chopping. I'm going for a rough chop here. I would say about pea size, just like the butter in my pie dough. All right, now that my pecans are chopped, it's time to make the filling. And you see a lot of pecan pie recipes that are made with corn syrup, but I'm actually going to use this Steen's cane syrup. You know, I think a lot of pecan pie can be really cloyingly sweet, so I'm trying to incorporate some bitter elements into the pie, and this has a really complex flavor. I'm gonna put some of this on the pecans that are going on top just to glaze them. It has kind of a caramel color. It's a little bit bitter. It's still sweet, but it has that like deep caramel flavor that I really like, and with a hint of sulfur, along with a little bit of salt. So just getting them nice and coated so they'll be glazed looking on top of the pie. All right, and I'm gonna pour the rest of this bottle into the sugar. My inspiration behind this pie recipe is my dad. He loves pecan pie and he loves cane syrup. In fact, he makes really good pancakes and he puts cane syrup on top of his pancakes instead of maple syrup. I grew up having this mysterious dark bottle in the pantry and figured that it might be a nice substitute for corn syrup in a pecan pie to give it a little bit more of a robust flavor. Okay, and to this mixture, I'm going to add salt. So you need salt in desserts. I have my bourbon, which is another way to introduce a different flavor to this pie. It gives it a little bit of that bite as well as a little bit of bitterness. I have vanilla. The last way that I introduced a little bit of bitterness to this usually very sweet pie is with unsweetened cocoa powder. It's not really gonna make it taste like chocolate, but it just gives it a rounder flavor. There is a bitterness in cocoa, and it gives it a little bit of a fudgy texture without really tasting the chocolate flavor. All right, I have some eggs here. I'm beating the eggs before I add them to the filling to make sure that they're really well incorporated and they're not going to be strands of whites throughout the filling. Okay, and I have some melted butter here. And now it's time for the pecans. Folding in the chopped pecans. I'm gonna grab my baking slab from the fridge. Okay, so we just have to fill this up. So this is pretty runny right now, but once it bakes, it'll set. It'll get a little jiggly and then it'll kind of puff up a little bit. Okay, and now the pecans that go on top. And I'm just gonna let these fall naturally. There was a time that I arranged pecans in perfectly concentric circles in pie, but not really at that point in my life anymore. Don't really have that kind of time. Just gonna sprinkle them on top. It doesn't have to be perfect. You just want people to see the pecans so they know what they're eating in case someone has a nut allergy. I've preheated the oven to 425 and I've placed a sheet pan in the oven to preheat as well. I just want a big blast of hot heat right at the beginning to set the crust, and then I'll lower the temperature. My pie has been cooking at 425 on the bottom rung of the oven. I'm going to rotate it and move it to the center of the oven to keep baking at 375 until it's set, a little jiggly in the middle, and puffed and golden brown. Okay, it's time to slice and serve. I love slab pies because they feed a crowd, and you can easily just wrap one in foil and take it to any gathering or party. You can serve this pecan pie with ice cream, but I really like it with unsweetened whipped cream. Just a little daddle, do ya? All right, after all that hard work, that's my bourbon pecan slab pie. It's time to give it a taste. The crust is buttery and flaky, and the filling is really good. It's complex because it has both the sweet and those bitter notes that I added. This is really good. I hope it makes its way to your table. I'm Rhoda from MadeIN, and I'll see you next time.
Perfect.